Jakarta Server Pages Architecture. Here you can see JSP Model 2 architecture diagram. Jakarta Server Pages, JSP, formerly Java Server Pages, is a collection of technologies that helps software developers create dynamically generated web pages based on HTML, XML, SOAP or other document types. Released in 1999 by Sun Microsystems, JSP is similar to PHP and ASP but uses the Java programming language. Here you can see JSP Model 1 architecture. In design of Java web applications, there are two commonly used design models referred to as Model 1 and Model 2. In Model 1, a request is made to a JSP or servlet, and then that JSP or servlet handle all responsibilities for the request, including processing the request, validating the request, handling the business logic, and generating the response. The Model 1 architecture is commonly used in smaller, simple task applications due to its ease of development. Although conceptually simple, this architecture is not conducive to large-scale application development because inevitably a great deal of functionality is duplicated in each JSP. Also, the Model 1 architecture unnecessarily ties together the business logic and presentational logic of the application. Combining business logic with presentation logic make it hard to introduce a new view or access point in an application. For example, in addition to an HTML interface, you might want to include a wireless markup language WML interface for wireless access. In this case, using Model 1 will unnecessarily require the duplication of the business logic with each instance of the presentation code. Here you can see a browser is connected to the request. Browser is connected to browser. The browser interacts with JSP page. Request is passed from browser to JSP page. JSP page. The logic and contents are inside the JSP page, and content source is connected to content in JSP page, and response is passed from JSP page to browser. Now we are focusing on web browser. Browser, software that allows a computer user to find and view information on the internet. Web browsers interpret the HTML tags in downloaded documents and format the displayed data according to a set of standard style rules. Here you can see the code segment. Instead of writing Java code that outputs HTML, JSP let you write HTML that contains Java code. here's a JSP file that outputs the same dynamic content, current date. As an example, save this to a file named date.jsp in your web app directory next to your index.html here. Now open a browser to date.jsp and you should see this here. When you visit the date.jsp file, the Jetty server, here we use Jetty server, automatically compiles it into a servlet class, which then works just like any other servlet. Note that this requires a Java server, so you can't upload .jsp file to any file host. It has to be a Java server. Now you can write HTML in Servlet. Instead of writing Java code that contains HTML like in Servlet, you can write HTML that contains Java code. This make it much easier to write a web page. Now we are focusing on server. Server, network computer program or device that processes request from a client. In the Java world, a servlet container, also known as web server, is like a light beer version of an application server. A servlet container handles request and response interactions and allows those interactions to interface with a subset of Java enterprise capabilities for web applications. A Java application server includes the servlet container as part of the full Java enterprise stack, including EJB, JPA, JMS, and more. As an example, we can consider Apache Tomcat. Apache Tomcat, called Tomcat for short, is a free and open source implementation of the Jakarta Servlet, Jakarta Expression Language, and WebSocket technologies. Tomcat provides a pure Java HTTP web server environment in which Java code can run. Oracle WebLogic Server. Oracle WebLogic Server is a Java EE application server currently developed by Oracle Corporation. Oracle acquired WebLogic Server when it purchased BEA Systems in 2008. As an example 3, we can consider this. This is in a WebLogic 12.2.1.4 JSP and Java EE. This is configuring Java server pages JSPs in JSPs where WebLogic 12.2.1.4. In order to deploy Java server pages, JSP files, you must place them in the root or in a subdirectory below the root of a web application. You define JSP configuration parameters in sub-elements of the JSP descriptor element in the WebLogic specific deployment descriptor weblogic.xml. These parameters define the following functionality: options for the JSP compiler, debugging, how often WebLogic server checks for updated JSPs that need to be recompiled, character encoding. Now we are focusing on servlet filter. This is controller. Jakarta servlet, formerly Java servlet, is a Java software component that extends the capabilities of a server. Although servlets can respond to many types of requests, they most commonly implement web containers for hosting web applications on Java servers and thus qualify as a server-side servlet web API. Such web servlets are the Java counterpart to other dynamic web content technologies such as PHP and ASP.NET. A filter is an object that performs filtering tasks on either the request to a resource, a servlet or static content, or on the response from a resource or both. Here you can see life of a JSP file. Here the JSP container. Here the translation occurs at this point if JSP has been changed or is new. If not, translation is skipped. So this is translation passed, and if not, this is Jakarta servlet, formerly a Java servlet. A Jakarta servlet possesses or stores a Java class in Jakarta EE that conform to Jakarta Servlet API. A standard for implementing Java class that responds to requests. Servlet could in principle communicate over any client server protocol, but they are most often used with the HTTP. The servlet is often used as shorthand for HTTP servlet. Thus, a software developer may use a servlet to add the dynamic content to a web server. Using Java platform. The generated content is commonly HTML. But may be other data such as XML or more commonly JSON. Servlets can maintain state in a session. Servlet can maintain state in session variables across many server transactions by using HTTP cookies or URL mappings. Jakarta Servlet API has to some extent been superseded by two standard Java technologies for web services: the Jakarta RESTful Web Services JAX-RS 2.0, useful for AJAX, JSON, and REST services, and the Jakarta XML Web Services JAX-WS, useful for SOAP web services. To deploy and run a servlet, a web container must be used. A web container, also known as a servlet container, is essentially the component of a web server that interacts with servlets. The web container is responsible for managing the lifecycle of servlets, mapping a URL to a particular servlet and ensuring that the URL request has the correct access rights. The servlet API contained in the Java package hierarchy javax.servlet defines the expected interactions of the web container and a servlet. A servlet is an object that receives the request and generates the response based on the request. The basic servlet package defines Java objects to represent servlet request and responses, as well as objects to reflect the servlet's configuration parameters in the execution environment. The package javax.servlet.http defines HTTP specific subclasses of generic servlet elements, including session management objects and that track multiple requests and responses between web server and the client. Servlet may be packaged in a WAR file as a web application. Servlets can be generated automatically from Jakarta server pages. JSP buys Jakarta server pages compiler. The difference between servlets and JSP is that servlets typically embed HTML inside Java code, while JSPs embed Java code in HTML. While the direct usage of servlets to generate HTML has become rare, the higher level of MVC web framework in Jakarta EE, JSF, still explicitly uses the servlet technology for the low-level request response handling via the Faces servlet. A somewhat older usage is to use servlets in conjunction with JSP in a pattern called Model 2, which is a flavor of Model View Controller. The current version of Servlet is 5.0 at this moment. Here you can see JSP containers. Here you can see the JSP request is passed from client to JSP page.jsp, and there are the if the translation occurs at this point, if JSP has been changed or is new, then JSP page is connected to JSP translator here, for example Tomcat, and JSP translate is connected to JSP source code Java, and JSP translate is connected to servlet source code Java. Servlet source code is connected to Java compiler embedded server, Java compile is connected to Java server class dot class, and Java JSP translator, and servlet source code, and Java compiler and server class is inside translation base, and server class is connected to JRE. JRE is connected to text buffer in memory. JRE and text buffer is connected to execution pace, and text buffer is connected to client. Response is passed from text buffer to client. And here if not translation is skipped, here that if JSP has not been changed or not new, then translation is skipped, and then JSP page.jsp is connected to text execution pace here, and it's connected to text buffer here in memory, and text buffer is connected to client here. Response is passed from text buffer in memory to client. As an example, we can consider this code segment. Here, the next let's update. Let's update the JSP page to work with Java Servlet. The idea is adding a web form, and on submit, the form will be processed by a servlet. Add this code between the body tags of the page. This HTML code adds a form with the text field, and a submit button to the page. The action attributes of the form specify the URL handles this form's submission. In this case, we specify the path which is relative to the application, and it points to the Java servlet which we will create. As an example too, we can consider jakarta.servlet, the module jakarta.servlet here. As an example 3, we can consider package jakarta.servlet. The jakarta.servlet package contains a number of classes and interfaces that describe and define the contracts between a servlet class and the runtime environment provided for an instance of such a class by a confirming servlet container. For versions prior to 4.0.2, these classes and interfaces are described by the Java Servlet API specification. For version 4.0.2 and later, they are described by the Jakarta Servlet specification. This package is in module jakarta.servlet. As an example 4, we can consider this servlet. This example servlet prints how many times its service method was called. Here the class HTTP servlet provides an abstract class to be subclass to create an HTTP servlet suitable for website. A subclass of HTTP servlet must override at least one method, usually one of these: do get, if the servlet supports HTTP get request; do post for HTTP post request; do put for HTTP put request; on delete for HTTP delete request; init and destroy to manage resources that are held for the life of the servlet; get servlet info, which the servlet uses to provide information about itself. There's almost no reason to override service method. Service handles HTTP request by dispatching them to the handler methods for each HTTP request by request type. The do xs methods, the do xxx methods listed previous here. Here the method void init servlet config called by the servlet container to indicate to a servlet that the servlet is being placed into service. The protected void service, HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response receives standard HTTP request from the public service method and dispatches them to the do xxx method defined in this class. Here you can see the destroy public void destroyed method called by the servlet container to indicate to a servlet that the servlet is being taken out of the service. As an example 5, we can consider interface servlet. Interface servlet defines method that all servlet must implement. A servlet is a small Java program that runs within a web server. Servlet receive and responds to requests from web clients, usually across HTTP, the hypertext transfer protocol. This interface is in package jakarta.servlet. And here is the code example of a Java servlet which supposed to handle logging request. It redirects the user to the home page if logging successful. Here the method in HTTP servlet request, the get the request dispatcher get request dispatcher string path returns request dispatcher object that acts as a wrapper for the resource located at the given path. A request dispatcher object can be used to forward a request to the resource or to include resource in response. The resource can be dynamic or static. As an example 7, we can consider interface servlet config. A servlet a servlet configuration object used by a servlet container to pass information to a servlet during initialization. This is in module jakarta.servlet and in package jakarta.servlet. We can, as an example, we can consider servlet mapping example here. This is in file web.xml. With regarding configuring servlets, you define servlet as part of the web application in several entries in J2EE standard web application deployment descriptor web.xml. The web.xml file is located in the web-inf directory of your web application. This one is basically, here we are talking about WebLogic server. The first entry, the web.xml file is located in web-inf directory of your web application. This is regarding WebLogic server. The first entry under the root servlet element in web.xml defines defines a name for the servlet and specify the compiled class that execute the servlet. Or instead of specifying servlet class, you can specify JSP also. You can specify JSP. The servlet element also contains definition for initialization attributes and security roles for the servlet. The second entry for in the web.xml under servlet mapping element defines the URL pattern that calls the servlet. Here this do filter belongs to filter chain method, filter chain here, and this is these are two different methods. So here as an example 10, create the following entry for the filter tag in the deployment descriptor file web.xml. Here this filter would apply to all JSP because we specified / asterisk in our configuration here. As an exception example, we can consider class Servlet exception. Defines a general exception a servlet can throw when it encounters difficulty. This is in module jakarta.servlet and package jakarta.servlet. Now we are focusing on JSP pages. This is a view. A JSP page is a textual document that describes how to create a response object from a request object for a given protocol. The processing of the JSP page may involve creating and or using other objects. Now we are focusing on life cycle of JSP. A JSP page services requests as a servlet. Thus, the life cycle and many of the capabilities of JSP pages, in particular the dynamic aspects, are determined by Java Servlet technology. When a request is mapped to a JSP page, the web container first checks whether JSP page servlet is older than the JSP page. If the servlet is older, the web container translates JSP page into a servlet class. And translate into a servlet class and compiles the class. During development, one of the advantages of JSP pages over servlets is that the build process is performed automatically. This is about translation and compilation. During the translation phase, each type of data in a JSP page is treated differently. Static data is transformed into code that will emit the data into the response stream. JSP elements are treated as follows. Directives are used to control how the web container translates and executes the JSP page. Scripting elements are inserted into the JSP page servlet class. Expression language expressions are passed as parameters to calls the JSP expression. JSP set or get property elements are converted into method calls to JavaBeans components. JSP include or forward elements are converted into invocations of the Java Servlet API. The JSP plugin elements is converted into browser specific markup for activating an applet. Custom tags are converted into calls to the tag handler that implements the custom tag. The application server, the source for the servlet, created from JSP page name in this file domain dir/generated/JSP/j2 ee-modules/var-name/page name _jsp.java. This is in Java Oracle version. Both the translation and the compilation paces can yield errors that are observed only when the page is requested for the first time. If an error is encountered during either phase, the server will return Jasper exception and a message that includes the name of the JSP page and the line where the error occurred. After the page has been translated and compiled, JSP page servlet, for the most part, follows the servlet life cycle. If the instance of the JSP pages servlet does not exist, the container loads the JSP pages servlet class, instantiates the instance of the servlet class, initializes the servlet instance by calling JSP init method, and the container invokes the _JSP service method, passing request and response objects. And if the container needs to remove the JSP pages servlet, it calls the JSP destroy method. Execution, you can control various JSP page execution parameters by using page directives. Buffering, when a JSP page is executed, output returned to the response object is automatically buffered. You can set the size of the buffering using the page directive greater than %@ page buffer equal, for example, none, or xxxxb kb $ less than. A larger buffer allows more content to be written before anything is actually sent back to the client, thus providing the JSP page with more time to set appropriate status codes and headers, or to forward to another web resource. The smaller buffer decreases server memory load and allows the client to start receiving more quickly. Handling JSP page errors. Any number of exceptions can arise when a JSP page is executed, to specifically that the web container should forward the control to an error page if an exception occurs, including following page directive at the beginning of your JSP page, and error page equal file name. This directive here the is error page equal true indicates that it is serving an as an error page. This directive makes an object of the type javax.servlet.jsp.error data available to the error page so that you can retrieve, interpret, and possibly display the information about cause of the exception in the error page. Here request, if the request is first time, then it's is connected to the creation. It can connect to the translation, compilation, loading, instantiation, and initialization are inside creation. Creation is connected to the request, and if then the request is not first time, the subsequent times is connected to, then it's connected to request here, and request is connected to the response, and request is connected to destruction. Now we are focusing on contracts between a JSP page and a JSP container. JSP page implementation class should use the JSP factory and page context classes to take advantages of platform specific implementation. A JSP page model. A JSP page is represented at execution time by a JSP page implementation object and is executed by a JSP container. A JSP page implementation object is a servlet. The JSP container delivers requests from a client to JSP page. Page implementation object and responses from to the JSP page implementation updates to the client. JSP page describes how to create response object. From the request object for a given protocol, possibly creating or using some other objects in the process. A JSP page may also indicate how some events are to be handled. In JSP 3.1, only init and destroy events allowed. Events are the allowed events. JSP container must render the JSP page for HTTP method get and post with identical responses. The response for head request to a JSP page must be identical to the response for the get request minus the response body. The behavior of JSP container is undefined for other methods. The protocol, the protocol seen by the web server. JSP container locates the appropriate instance of the JSP page implementation class and delivers the request to it using servlet protocol. A JSP container may need to create such a class dynamically from JSP page source before delivering a request and response object to it. Servlet class define the contract between JSP container and the JSP page implementation class. When the HTTP protocol is used, the contract is described by the HTTP servlet class. Most JSP pages use the HTTP protocol, but other protocols are allowed by this specification. JSP container automatically makes a number of server-side objects available to JSP page implementation object. The protocol seen by the JSP page author. The JSP specification defines the contract between JSP container and the JSP page author. This contract defines the assumptions an author can make for the actions described in the JSP page. The main portion of this contract is the _JSP service method that is generated automatically by the JSP container from the JSP page. The contract also describes how a JSP author can indicate that what actions will be taken when the init method and destroy the methods of the page implementations occur. In JSP 3.1, this is done by defining methods with the names JSP init and JSP destroy. In the declaration scripting element of the JSP page, the JSP init method if present will be called to prepare the page before the first request is delivered. Similarly, the JSP container can reclaim resources by used by the JSP page when the request is being when a request is not being serviced by the JSP page by invoking its JSP destroyed method if present. A JSP page author may not redefine servlet's method through declaration scripting element. The JSP specification serves names for methods and variables starting with JSP JSPX and JSPX in any combination of upper and lower case. The HTTP JSP page interface. The enforcement of the contract between JSP container and the JSP page author is aided by the requirement that servlet class corresponding to the JSP page must implement jakarta.servlet.jsp.http JSP page interface or jakarta.servlet.jsp.jsp page interface if the protocol is not HTTP. If it is HTTP, jakarta.servlet.jsp.http JSP page interface. The JSP page implementation class. The JSP container creates a JSP page implementation class for each JSP page. Name of the JSP page implementation class is implementation dependent. The JSP page implementation object belongs to an implementation dependent named package. The package used may vary between one JSP and another, so minimal assumptions should be made. As of JSP 2.0, it is illegal to refer to any classes from the unnamed, also known as default package. This will result in translation error. This restriction also applied for all other cases where classes are referenced, such as when specifying the class name for a tag in a TLD. The JSP container may create the implementation class for a JSP page, or a superclass may be provided by the JSP page author through the use of the extent attribute in the page directive. The extend mechanism is available for sophisticated users. It should be used with extreme care as it restricts decisions that a JSP container can make. It may restrict efforts to improve the performance. For example, the JSP page implementation class will implement jakarta.servlet.servlet and requests are delivered to the class as per the rules in the Servlet 6.0 specification. A page implementation class may depend on support classes. If the JSP page implementation class is packaged into a var, any dependent classes will have to be included, so it will be portable across all JSP containers. A JSP page author writes a JSP page expecting that the client and the server will communicate using a certain protocol. The JSP container must generate that request to and responses from the page that use protocol. Most JSP pages use HTTP, and the implementation class must implement the HTTP JSP page interface, which extends JSP page. If the protocol is not HTTP, then the class will implement an interface that extends JSP page. API contracts. The contract between JSP container and the Java class implementing JSP page corresponds to the servlet interface. Responsibility for adhering to this contract rests on the JSP container implementation if the JSP page does not use extend attribute of the JSP directive. If it extend attribute of the JSP directive is used, JSP page author must generate that the superclass given in the extend attribute supports this contract. Here is how the JSP contract processes JSP pages. Void JSP init. The method is optionally defined in the JSP page. Method is invoked when the JSP page is initialized, and when the method is called, all the methods in the servlet, including get service, servlet config, are available. Void JSP destroy. The method is optionally defined in the JSP page. Method is invoked before destroying the page. Void underscore JSP service, servlet requested subtype, servlet request, so response subtype. Method may not be defined in the JSP page. The JSP container automatically generates this method based on the content of the JSP page. Method invoke at each client request. Request and response parameters. The methods in the contract between JSP container and the JSP page require request and response parameters. The formal type of the request parameter, which this specification calls servlet request subtype, is an interface that extends jakarta.servlet.servlet request. The interface must define a protocol dependent request contract between the JSP container and the class that implements the JSP page. Likewise, the formal type of the response parameter, which is specification called servlet response subtype, is an interface that extends jakarta.servlet.servlet response. The interface must define the protocol dependent response contract between the JSP container and the class that implements the JSP page. The request and response interfaces describe the protocol dependent contract between JSP container and the class that implements the JSP page. The HTTP contract is defined by jakarta.servlet.http servlet request and jakarta.servlet.http servlet response interfaces. The JSP page interface refers to these methods but cannot describe synthetically the methods involving servlet request response subtypes. However, the interfaces for specific protocols that extend JSP page can just as HTTP JSP page describe them for the HTTP protocol. JSP containers that confirm this specification, both the JSP page implementation classes and JSP container runtime, must support request and response interfaces for HTTP protocol. With regarding omitting the extends attribute by using separate underscore JSP 1344 and For example, HTTP superclass, the JSP page translator does not need to discover whether JSP page includes declaration with JSP init or JSP destroy. And using the extend attribute, if the JSP page author uses extends, the generator class is identical to the one then except that the class name is not specified in the extend attribute. The contract on the JSP page implementation class does not change. The JSP container should check, usually through reflection, that the provided superclass implements HTTP JSP page if the protocol is HTTP or JSP page otherwise. If the protocol is HTTP, the EC should implement HTTP JSP page. All the methods in the servlet interface are declared final. Additionally, it is the responsibility of the JSP page author that the provider superclass satisfies the service method of the servlet API, invokes the _ JSP service method. The init servlet config method stores the configuration that make available via get servlet config, then invokes JSP init. The destroy method invokes JSP destroy. The JSP container may give a fatal translation error if it detects that the provided superclass does not satisfy this requirement, but most JSP containers will not check them. Here you can see a JSP container is here, and init event is passed to JSP init, and request is passed to _ JSP service, and JSP service is connected to response. Destroy event is passed to JSP destroy, and here you can see the JSP page. And this is the request processing page, and this is translation page. This is request processing and translation here. As an example, we can consider jakarta.servlet.jsp module. As an example 2, we can consider package javax.servlet.jsp. So actually javax is the older version. So here jakarta.servlet.jsp, as an example, we are considering package jakarta.servlet.jsp. Classes and interfaces for the core JSP 3.1 API. This is in module jakarta.servlet.jsp. As an example 3, we can consider an instance of an implementation dependent subclass of page context abstract class can be created by JSP implementation class at the beginning of its _JSP service. Method via the implementation's default JSP factory. Actually, here is one example of how to use these classes. Here you can see page context, the class page context. Page context extends JSP context to provide useful context information for when JSP technology is used in the servlet environment. And here you can see initialized implicit variables for here you can see error pass URL is here, and this request response for the page context, and error pass URL here is needs session here. JSP writer.default underscore buffer. This is auto flush, is true here. And here you can see initialize implicit variables for scripting environment. And the body of the translated JSP is here. And here is a code example of a Java servlet, which is supposed to handle logging request. It redirect the user to the home page if logging successful. Here you can see the in the HTTP servlet request get request dispatcher string path returns a request dispatcher object that acts as a wrapper for the resource located at the given path. The dispatcher object can be used to forward the request to the resource, or include a resource in the response. The resource can be dynamically resource can be dynamic or static. Note that this kind of forward from servlet to JSP the URL on the web browser, the browser remains unchanged. It is the URL of the servlet, even we specify the JSP page. This is check logging here. So here, as an example 5, instead of writing Java code that outputs HTML, JSP lets you to write HTML, but HTML that contains Java code. Here's a JSP file that outputs the same dynamic. I put dynamic contents here. Save this file to a file name date.jsp in your web app directory next to your index.html, for example. Now open the browser to date.jsp, and you should see like this. And when you visit the date.jsp file, here, for example, JTserve automatically compiles it into a servlet class, which then works just like any other servlet. Note that this requires a Java server, so you can't upload .jsp file to any file host. It has to be a Java server. But now, instead of writing Java code that contains HTML, you can write HTML that contains Java code. This makes it much easier to write web page. We are considering as an example 6. We can consider this very simple JSP page. Here the main topic is packaging JSP pages. Here JSP page is delivered in a source form, for example, or this is like to be the most common example, and in the another example, JSP page is compiled into Servlet that uses only Servlet 6.0 and JSP 3.1 API calls. The Servlet is then packaged into a var with a deployment descriptor such that it looks as the original JSP page to any client. So we start with a very simple JSP page, hello world.jsp, for example here, and the JSP page package as a source var file if you want. The JSP page can be packaged into a var file by just placing it at location / hello world.jsp in a default JSP page exception matching will pick it up. You can use the normal web.xml file and the servlet for the compiled JSP page. As an alternative, we will show how one can compile the JSP page into a servlet class to run it in a JSP container here. The JSP page is compiled into a servlet with some implementation dependent name com.acme. JSP hello world _xxx _impl. The servlet code only depends on the JSP 3.1 and Servlet 6.0 APIs, and this is as follows. Here the web application descriptor is here. The servlet is made look as a JSP page with following web.xml. Finally, everything is packaged together into a var /web -ina /web.xml and /-ina /classes /com /acme _JSP hello world _xxx _impl.class. Note that if the servlet class generated for the JSP page had dependent on some other supported classes, they would have to be included in the var. As an exception example, we can consider JSP exception, class JSP exception. a generic exception known to the JSP engine. Uncaught JSP exceptions will result in invocation of the error page machinery. This is in module jakarta.servlet.jsp and package jakarta.servlet.jsp. Here you can, as an error example, we can consider this one. The following directive requests no buffering and provide an error page. The page directive attribute error page defines a URL to a resource to which any Java programming language throwable objects thrown but not caught by the page implementation are forwarded for error processing. Any number of exceptions can arise when JSP page is executed. To specify that the web page container should forward the control to an error page if an exception occurred, include this directive here, and you can see the error page here. Here you can see this directive makes an object type javax. Here, for example, jakarta.servlet.jsp.error data available to the error page, so that you can retrieve, interpret, and possibly display information about the cause of the exception in the error page. To access the error data object in an EL expression language expression by the way of the page context, thus $ open brace curly brace page context dot error data dot status code close curly brace retrieves the status codes, and here the $ open brace page context dot error data dot throwable date dot throwable retrieves the exception. Here the cause, you can retrieve the cause of the exception using this expression here. You can see cause here. You can also define an error pages for the var file var that contains the JSP page. If the error pages are defined for both var and the JSP page, the JSP page error page take precedence. As an example 7, we can consider JSP model 1 architecture here, and here here you can see monolithic or compound JSP here. When JSP were first introduced, some developers recognized their potential to replace the awkwardness of embedding HTML output in a servlet with the convenience of scripting. Many decided that since JSP were passed into servlets internally, they were just a new syntax for servlets, so they built servlets including access to models, control logic, and output. This example shows the worst case of JSP design here. Actually, here the this example has some problems. It performs operations belonging to the model, view, and the controller. The example of this example combines the functionality of JSP and servlets, but represent the worst of both worlds from the point of view of maintenance. The HTML is confusing, often duplicated. Uh, and spread throughout the file in an opaque way. The Java code is embedded awkwardly, again hard to find and follow. There are actually two common anti-patterns. The monolithic JSP anti-pattern occurs when JSP pages do more than their fair share of the work. Often acting as both view and controller. While this example doesn't interact directly with the model via JNDI or JDBC, it would be a logical extension, further destroying the separation of model and controller. A closely related anti-pattern is the compound JSP anti-pattern, in which multiple JSP files are crammed into one using Java conditionals. In the example here, our code exists the return value of a call to do logging, and displays different pages based on the result. Now we are focusing on JavaBeans model. In computing based on Java platform, JavaBeans is a technology developed by Sun Microsystems and released in 1996 as part of JDK 1.1. As an example, we can consider this code segment. Here you can see the action JSP colon useBean. A JSP colon useBean action associates an instance of a Java programming language object defined within a given scope and available with the given ID with the newly declared scripting variable of the same ID. Here you can see the attribute ID, the name used to identify the object instance in the specified scope namespace, and also the scripting variable name declared and initialized with that object reference. The name specified in this case sensitive. The name specified is case sensitive and shall conform to the current scripting language variable naming conventions. And here you can see class attribute, the fully qualified name of the class that defines the implementation of the object. The class name is case sensitive. If the class and bean name attributes are not specified, object must be present in the given scope. Here you can see this is introduce a new block here, and here the tag above creates or obtain a customer bean reference, associate it with the name customer in the page context, and declared a Java programming language variable of the same name initialized to the object reference in this block scope. Here you can see the usage of it, and here close the block. The variable customer is out of scope now, but the object is still valid and accessible via page context. As an example 2, we can consider this one. The action JSP colon set property. The JSP colon set property action sets the values of properties in a bean. The name attributes that denotes the bean must be defined before this action appears. Here you can see attribute name. The name of a bean instance defined by JSP colon use bean action or some other action. The bean instance must contain the property to be set. The defining action must appear before JSP colon set property action in the same file. The property attributes, the name of the property whose value will be set. If property name is set to asterisk, then the tag will iterate over the current servlet request parameters, matching parameter names and values types to property names and setter methods types, setting each match property to the value of the matching parameter. If a parameter has a value of null, that means empty string, double quotation, the corresponding property is not modified. Here you can see the value attributes, the value to assign to the given property. This attribute can accept a request time attribute expression as a value. The action may not have both param and value attributes. As an example 3, we can consider action JSP colon get property. The JSP colon get property action places the value of a bean instance property converted to a string into an implicit out object from which the value can be displayed as output. The bean instance must be defined as indicated in the name attributes before this point in the page, usually via a JSP colon use bean action. Here you can see a name attribute, the name of the object instance from which the property is obtained. Here you can see property attribute, names, the property to get. Here as an example 4, you can see here the expression language. Here $, open curly brace, JavaBeans dot variable, closing curly brace. The value of the variable in the object JavaBeans is this one. Here the expression language, and expression language makes it possible to easily access application data stored in JavaBeans components. As an example 5, we can consider this one. This is in expression language, this code segment. There are two constructs to represent EL expressions, that is the $ expression and hash then expression here. While EL passes and evaluate $ and hash in the same way, additional restrictions are placed on the usage of these delimiters in JSP pages. EL expression that is evaluated immediately is represented in JSP with syntax $, open curly brace, closing curly brace, while EL expression whose evaluation is deferred is represented with the syntax hash open curly brace, then expression, and then closing curly brace here. So as an example 6, we can consider this code segment. So in the controller class, we have already created an object of an employee bean here, and pass some values by using setter methods of the bean class. This object is then stored into set attribute method of the HTTP servlet request object. We forward this request object to the beandata.jsp by using request dispatcher to make the attributes available there. Here this method is called by the servlet container to process GET request. Is storing bean in session here. As an error example, we can consider this one. Here they cannot find any information on property data in a bean type, bean of type com.example.csa_server.db funcs. Now we are focusing on data sources, database. SQL actions operate on a data source as defined by the Java class javax.sql.dataSource. A data source object provides connection to the physical data source it represents. Within the context of a connection retrieved from the data source, SQL statements are executed and results are returned. Database, also called electronic database, any collection of data or information that is specially organized for a rapid search and retrieval by a computer. Databases are structured to facilitate the storage, retrieval, modification and deletion of data in conjunction with various data processing operations. A database management system, DBMS, extracts information from the database in response to queries. As an example, we can consider this code segment. In this example, we are going to learn about this select operation of fetching records from Guru test Guru underscore test table, which was created before in above section here. Here the SQL colon data set data source exports a data source either as a scoped variable or as the data source configuration variable jakarta.servlet.jsp.jstl.sql.data source. Here here we are connecting data source and here naming variables, and the driver as JDBC driver here. Also adding username and password with guru root and guru. Here we are using SQL query of this SQL query of the select query. Here we are printing the output for employee ID and EMP name, which are fetched from the results of the query. And using for each loop, we print the output. With two records, for example, when you execute this code, we will with additional code required, we will get the output like this here. Here the two records will be fetched from the database here. Here table headings are excluded in the output display here. As an example, we can consider, as example 2, we can consider this code segment. Here we can see interface connection, a connection session with a specific database. SQL statements are executed. SQL statements are executed and results are returned within the context of a connection. Interface connection is in module java.sql package and in the package java.sql. Here you can see the usage within a JSP page. This is the employee DAO class. Here you can see a create statement using connection object. and execute the query or update query. And process SQL exception. This is end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.